want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brantflex here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. For today's video, I want to go over the complex mulligans you can have as Fairy Force Roach combo deck, and kind of branch off into the multiple types of hands that you can get from those positions, and how to best navigate them. And I'll cover 3 types of mulligans you can have, and then the variations that will generate off of that. And hopefully it'll make sense as I go into the video, because I know that Forest has a lot of weird things going on, and there's no way I'll be able to cover all the variations and explain them all, but hopefully my rambling will kind of spark some inspiration if you're playing and you're not getting the very easy like early game into one-shotting them with double roach on turn 7, because that does happen a lot, and that's what I think that's what bugs a lot of non-Forest players when they're playing against Forest, are those perfect quote-unquote hands that a lot of Forest players get, where they get the on-curve, fairy generators into Goblet Staff on an empty board, and then suddenly a roach pops out with a baby carbuncle being super evoed, and they take 15 on turn 7 for fun. So obviously, I probably don't need to explain those hands very much, but there are a lot more hands that exist within the Roach game progression, just because it is a card game, and you can't draw perfectly every game. So hopefully my explanation here will help you guys with that learning process. So the very first mulligan I want to talk about is going to be the active mulligan. Now the active mulligan to me is the one where you either flip your cards into or just naturally have a very good forward presence on the board. And so this forward presence is having stuff like Good Fairy of the Pond, Fairy Tamer, in my case Capricious Sprite. You guys might not have it because you're playing the Carbuncle version. An earlier Goblet Staff, maybe a Fae, May, maybe a Lily. So the reason why these are very active mulligans is because you push yourself onto the board very early on, and that means you're applying a lot of pressure, but also means that your hand technically doesn't have a lot of your win conditions for later on down the line. So a lot of the time, if you're against something that's really slow like Haven or Rune, you can often win the game before that becomes relevant. But we can go down the 2 tracks that will inevitably occur after you go through that active mulligan, and then your deck continues to roll forward. So there are the kind of draws where you just simply natural into your ideal game plan. So for example, you play the entire 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 curve, like Good Fairy, Fairy Tamer, something, Double Fairy, Fae, and then Glade, and then you, like, let's say turn 3, you drop the Goblet Staffs. Now you have now you have your Roach, you have Goblet Staff on board, and you just like clear the board a little bit, and then you one-shot them on turn 7. Very easy, very simple. Let's say that you don't draw your Roach that quickly, but you manage to get Goblet Staff on the board. Now you have to decide whether or not it's actually appropriate to go for, I guess, like a more generic spam to draw more cards, or if you want to hold back and just like control as much as possible, if that makes sense. So there are really 2 ways I look at this. One way is the one where you draw really neutral cards like Bug Alerts and Fairy Convocation, and in these scenarios it's actually really hard to get pressure on the board, because something like Bug Alert and stuff like Carbuncle, they just return cards to your hand while doing very little to progress your tempo advantage or your base chip. So in those cases, it's actually not bad to just try and keep your hand around like 6 or 7 cards, so that if you draw a Glade, you can just play the Glade without worrying about your Overdraw. And then obviously, if you get stuff like Olivia and Glade, you want to make sure your hand's manageable enough so that you can draw into your Roach without overdrawing. But there are certain cases where you just can't empty your hand because you have like Bales sitting in your hand that you really don't want to use. And if you don't have a Roach and you have like 2 or 3 0-cost Bales, honestly, if you're gonna die or lose a lot of HP because you don't play the Bale, you're better off just playing the Bale and just trying to generate value from Cairn if you have it in your hand, for example, and then just hoping that you get a Roach as your like 17th, 18th, or 19th card, and just praying that it's not on your bottom 15. And if you had an active mulligan, it's even more difficult to play around because you had so little of your card draw in the beginning, and it's really rough. And then again, the other side of this is where you have a really easy game where you draw your active mulligan into Roach, and then you just one-shot your opponent at turn 7 because you had a nice and clean start. Now, the second type of mulligan I want to talk about is going to be the passive mulligan. Now, the passive mulligan is the one where you don't draw your early Good Fairy, your early Fairy Tamer, your early Fae. Or maybe you draw your Fae and you don't draw the early Fairy generator, so you don't have the turn 4 or turn 3 if you have coin, or if you're going second rather, Fairy Fae. So in these scenarios, when you're the passive player, you're really looking for ways to solve the game and reduce your HP loss while maximizing your draw. And these are hands that, again, look like you have like Fae, Lily, a Godwood Staff, and like a Glade. These hands are not the worst because you can play something early. Actually, no, yeah, let's get even more passive. Let's say that your opening hand is like Godwood Staff, Glade, and then Olivia, and maybe a Roach. These hands are really ugly, and honestly, they're passive to the point that you're probably gonna lose if you're unlucky with the matchup. Like, let's say you're playing against Face Dragon with that opening hand. Your mulligan was probably not correct, unless you just had bad cards and you mulligan bad cards, then enjoy your free loss, I guess. But these passive mulligans, you really want to look to maximize your HP retention. And this really comes in the form of like using your maze, like saving your maze and saving your fairies to proc May, saving your fairies to proc Lily, saving your combo pieces to like reduce the amount of damage, or saving your combo pieces so that when you draw God with Staff, you can immediately start drawing, or dumping your quote-unquote bad combo pieces so that you can keep your hand open. And by dumping your combo pieces, I mean stuff like, oh, I play a May and then I play Bug Alert and then I play May again to clear one card. That feels really bad because you've just used 3 cards to deal 1 damage. Technically 1 card because you're replaying May. 2 cards because you're replaying May twice. But that's the sort of thing you have to do when you have a really passive hand. And your goal with this passive hand is that eventually you'll stall long enough to get your roaches, and then because your hand was passive, you've managed to retain enough like 0 costs so that you can reach your opponent's higher average HP total with that bigger damage slam. Now the passive mulligan is somewhat comforted, or somewhat cushioned rather, let's say, by the existence of Arya, because Arya allows you to catch up on the chip damage you missed from a bad early game because of her nature of just giving you immediately 4 damage to the face if your opponent has 1 big minion instead of multiple small minions. And then obviously, as the game progresses, you'll have more face damage from fairies being played. If you're playing the Carbuncle style, then that's ironically not as big of an issue because Carbuncle gives you so much more reach than the Arya style decks that at that point you're just stalling because you know that the moment you draw Roach, you can one-shot your opponent. And so it's fine to be passive with the Carbuncle deck because you have the potential to do like 16, 17 damage. And I probably should have described the branches here, but the main branches for passive mulligans are going to be pure control, hand dumping to draw more, and then the very interesting, I guess, like Roach spam. And that'll make sense once I get there. So control, I already covered. You're just saving combo pieces so you can efficiently clear the board while continuing to draw with your Godwood Staff that you hopefully drew as you're delaying for the Roach. And then the hand dumping, fairy dumping, you're dumping your hand. Like, let's say that you have way too many fairy generators and you have a bunch of Glades and a bunch of Olivias in your hand. In these scenarios, you want to make sure your hand is as empty as possible so that you can play, or so you can draw into Roach. But the issue with that is knowing, like, just seeing ahead into the future and knowing that you need to dump your hand sooner on. And this ironically comes with a nuance of when you should cast Fairy Convocation, because Fairy Convocation is technically a +1 to your hand size, and so you ironically sometimes do not want to cast Fairy Convocation, because if you cast Fairy Convocation, that means 2 turns in the future, you might burn a card because you have 1 card too many from casting Fairy Convocation, and that might mean you burn a Roach and lose the game because of that. So that's what I mean by fairy dumping, or like really, really tight hand management. If you have no Roaches and a really wide hand, and that wide hand generates more cards, you have to really look into the future and understand how can I most efficiently dump this hand so that I can continue drawing. And then the, I guess, side branch of that is when you already have a Roach and a Godwood Staff, or maybe double Roach in your hand, how to maximize the amount of 0 costs and cheap spells you can keep in your hand so that you can just slap your opponent really hard. Like, if you have, let's say you have a Cairn, you have a Bug Alert, you have a Roach, and you've Godwood Staff on board, your deck is almost complete by now, especially with like 1 or 2 Bales, because that means that if your opponent plays a taunt, you have ways to get through that taunt because of Bales and Fairies, and you don't really care about the rest of your deck because you've already achieved your win condition. If you have like 3 0 costs, like 4 0 costs, and a few 1 cost spells or cards, you can easily deal 18 damage by turn 8 or 9, and way more with Carbuncle way earlier. So you have to understand at what point is it, I need to dump my hand so I can draw my win con, versus I have my win con, now how do I increase the amount of damage I can deal so that my win con is easier to reach, if that makes sense. So The last part of the passive mulligan is going to be hands where you have roaches really early on, but you have no other plays, but you happen to draw stuff like Bug Alert and extra Goblet Snaps early on, or even multiple roaches. And so this is the most interesting way of playing the deck, because these type of draws usually mean that you don't have a good early game, but instead of having a good early game, you just beat the crap out of your opponent with roach flips. And by roach flips, I literally mean like turn 5, you play one fairy, you play a roach, you evil a roach, hit your opponent for 4, and then Bug Alert the roach. And this is really good against a lot of decks, because any point of damage you're dealing as this craft is damage that you're using to further your win con. And it's really funny seeing, because this is actually the main way you win in the mirror matchup, because the mirror matchup is all about killing the other force player from 15, 16, 17, because force is so good at clearing other force players' boards that you're not really getting much major chip damage to begin with. Like if you have the perfect early game and they have like a half decent like response, they're gonna be at 14, 15 HP. But being at 14, 15 HP is literally solved by a single turn where the guy plays like Deepwood Bounty into a fairy, roach, deal 7 to you with the Evo, and then they bounce it with a Bug Alert. You spent like 4 turns dealing that 7 damage to them with an early game, and they dealt it back in 1 turn and cleared your board at the same time. So if you see those angles, like those hands where you have too many Bug Alerts, but you also have a roach, those hands are actually quite good, because you can set up for a top deck double roach counter kill like very simply. And that's actually how I win a lot of games, and I wouldn't have seen those wins if I didn't know about that. And so the last type of hand, I guess, progression we can talk about is going to be the coping mulligans. And these coping mulligans are just going to be the ones where you don't have a great early game, but you don't have a great control set, and with like bunch of card draw. And I vaguely kind of mentioned this or like alluded to this coping mulligan already. These are mulligans where you have like multiple Bug Alerts, you have like a Lily and Cairn, but you don't have Goblet Staff. Maybe you have one Bale, maybe you have a late Olivia. And these hands are kind of the hardest ones to pilot, because you really have to think about how you're stalling out, how you're best pacing your resources so that you don't just randomly die to an opponent with a really good curve. And granted, you might still die to an opponent with a good curve, because these are like your most weird to worst hands. And again, it's stuff like, oh, I drew 2 Lilies and a Bale, or I drew 2 Lilies, a Glade, and a Cairn. And you might think this hand is like it's not a bad hand, but it's a really weird hand. And for me, the way I'd approach those type of hands is understanding how important my EVA points are for clearing, or how efficient they are for clearing the enemy's board. And so I guess it's kind of gets away from the hand shape and more into how you should efficiently use EVA points. But if you have multiple Lilies and a Glade, in my opinion, you actually just kind of want to use Lily as a body instead of an actual way to draw. And the reason why I say that is because Glade is almost always significantly more efficient than Lily is as an Evo point consumer, because he clears so much more, and he's also drawing you cards anyways. Now obviously you can use Lily early on, like let's say that you play the early Lily and then you Cairn it to make it a 2/4, and then somehow she survives to turn 4 and she's not, and you unlock your Evo point. I think very obviously you're going to Evo that Lily, ping one of your enemy's cards, and then swing for the 2 extra damage. And that's totally fine, and that's an angle you should look for. But if it's like it's like a back and forth, and I see that they went wide on board, I'm just gonna use the Glade to clear it. Or on the other hand, let's say that your opponent doesn't play anything really necessarily suspicious, like nothing scary on turn 4, and now it's your turn 5. Let's say that it's Abyss, and they played the little like 1/2 that spawns 2 minions, and that's it. You do not have to Glade in that scenario. You just want to play Glade and let them decide what to do with that Glade, because a 1/2 is not serious enough. And maybe you don't even want to play Glade. Maybe you just want to use Lily and like clear the minions with Lily instead, which I would disagree with, because I think that EVA point again is better spent on Glade. But if you think your hand is really that bad, like you don't have Goblet Staff, you don't have Roach, you don't have your Olivia to stabilize, you don't have a Arya to make your mid game better, like the worse your hand looks, the more you want to draw. The less win conditions you have, the more you want to draw. And I guess this is kind of like a really good summary of the entire concept of this video, is that the better your hand is, the less you care about drawing and overdrawing. The worse your hand is, the more you want to make sure that the resources that are available in your hand go far, and you want to make sure you can draw as much as possible to make it look better. And it's kind of a really difficult game because, again, there are really straightforward games with forests, but these really, really awkward hands and shapes come up way more often than you think. And oftentimes, these awkward hand shapes are not even that bad. They're still very, very broken and good. You just have to know what you're looking at, and hopefully this video will help you learn how to do that. So, pretty rambly video. I hope all this made sense. I'll try and include some graphics and stuff on the screen as the post editing. But yeah, probably not my best video, but I hope it made sense if you stayed this far. Anyways, hope you have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.